the natural tendency is that, you present them with something and then they would say, well, we have zero tolerance, or we have very low level of tolerance. So that was a bit of an education, a bit of a dialogue, that not everything for a company like them is going to be zero tolerance and low tolerance. Otherwise, you're just going to have like almost like a significant, if not unlimited amount of resources to dedicate to this.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative, in conjunction with Cyber Reason, is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Adel Melek, Global Vice Chair, Advisory at Deloitte.
Thanks, Todd, and great to be with you. I think it's a long story, Todd, but many of us, I think, at the beginning of our careers, kind of like, got drafted into this space one way or the other. And, at the time I was working for Deloitte, I had a double major, both in accountancy, and I'm a CPA, but at the same time, I actually studied and I got my master's degree in computer science and software engineering. So it just I think it was the perfect intersect to help many of our clients. At the beginning of time, I think it was just like helping them broadly around IT and mainframes, mid-range. I remember back in the days, kind of like doing all the RACF and ACF2 and, AS400. I'm dating myself here, moving into Unix and the rest of it. And I think, it's the natural progression, like as we started, towards the late 90s, ahead of the year 2000 and the advent of the internet. I think we were like one of the early adopters, and I was like really involved in that from the get-go, and have since been involved with the cyber practice. I founded our practice in Canada, then eventually became the global leader for cyber at Deloitte for about 7-8 years, then eventually became Deloitte managing partner, global managing partner for all of our suite of risk products. So I'm not day to day now in cyber, but I continue to advise boards and work with executive management on matters related to broader risk, the strategic risk, and obviously cyber continues to be one of the top 5.
I always find it's interesting when people enter the cybersecurity field, and things were different then, and there really is much more of a field, I guess, today, but that people enter from different professions, like accountancy. I myself was a mathematics and then I was an accountancy major, and ended up with a degree in business administration, and then got a job as a computer programmer. And looking back on that, I always wondered, what's the thread there? And it seems to be there's this logical connection between all those different things, that there's an analytical way of thinking in this field.
Yeah, you're very right, Todd. I mean, I remember that when I was founding this group, and it was all about recruiting and bringing in the right talent. This was a different domain for a big 4 back then, that I'm going recruiting people with engineering background, mathematics. And mathematics, in many countries, it's almost like a proxy for what eventually became computer science, if you will. And I've even I was as it happens today, I was Googling, and on Google they were celebrating Forgot the name of the fellow, but he's the professor who actually invented what they call it like fuzzy logic, which eventually led into a branch of mathematics and a branch of computer science. But yeah, I mean, it's all about like the discipline of being able to follow a structured process, a methodical process, and then the aptitude to learn, the curiosity to get into something new.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. That the curiosity to learn is just such a it's almost kind of a sought after trait in interviewing people.
Yeah, absolutely. And we like at Deloitte at the time, I mean, we went and we hired a number of luminaries. You and I were talking earlier about Stephen Katz. I mean, Steve was formidably, I guess, the first CISO ever at Citigroup. So upon his retirement, we engaged Steve, and he was like one of our aspirational luminaries within Deloitte, helping many of our kind of like professionals get a good grasp on this. I remember back in the day, I almost kind of like made it mandatory for all our partners to get their CISP. And they hated me for that, but I think people just like hate to be examined and be subjected to attending courses and tests and stuff like that. But I even hired like two of these master trainers with the ISC square, and we must have generated I think at one point in time, I lost count now, but I think we reached 2,000 people very quickly, and we became like the first or the second largest organization with number of CSSPs, I think only after the federal government of the US.
Wow. That's quite an accomplishment. So you wrote a great piece for the book CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, of which you were clearly one of those pioneers in helping to shape this industry. And you talked about determining the risk appetite with the board. Could you walk us through some of the thoughts in that article?
Sure, Todd. I mean, it's I think to some degree, sadly, at least back then, it was just like a repeated occurrence that an organization would have like a large security incident or a large security breach, and then all of a sudden they kind of like they get religion, and everybody at the most senior level would would want to kind of like establish some element of combination of their corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility. So at the time, and this was like really not uncommon, I got called in and just like had a couple of sessions with the board, and kind of like very intelligent business, accomplished people. But as you could imagine, and even to this day, I mean, this is unless you're dealing with a very sophisticated organization, it's the usual. It's a scattered type of topics. People coming up with kind of like their own ideas about what the problem is. Some of the people are feeling embarrassed to ask questions because they are not really well versed in this domain. And there is no framework, like they had no framework of kind of like saying, how do we make this a topic that is digestible, and it is within the framework of how any board would be operating. So I think we landed on a number of things that we agreed to. First, we agreed that we're gonna help them kind of like engage with the various stakeholders within the organization to really get a perspective on, starting with the business objectives. What are their business objectives? Then kind of like, linking that to the way that they run their own organization, like what is your enterprise operational framework, including op risk and IT risk and other domains of risk, the three layers of risk. Then we got to develop a set of, if you want to call them, specific risk domains. And it's not just like the typical CIA. I think, we expanded upon, like, take something like confidentiality, break that down into, like, maybe 4 or 5 specific, domains, and then get to talk about, like, walk them through a process, of what is your risk tolerance? What could go wrong in this specific area? Why is your risk tolerance categorized that way? Then, if after a bit of an education, because the natural tendency is that, you present them with something and then they would say, well, we have zero tolerance, or we have very low level of tolerance. So that was a bit of an education, a bit of a dialogue, that not everything for a company like them is going to be zero tolerance and low tolerance. Otherwise, you're just going to have like almost like a significant, if not unlimited, amount of resources to dedicate to this. Then working with them to develop representative risk statements, similar to any other risk domain that they have, whether it is financial, regulatory, reputational, any other risk. So something that would be equivalent to that. And then linking that to how would they typically, report to the board. So typically reporting to the board would be kind of like, here are the KRIs, the key risk indicators, and KPIs. How do you measure these things? So we kind of like, help them kind of like figure this whole thing end to end. In addition, we came up with a bunch of suggestions just to help them kind of like move up the maturity curve. So, for example, we suggested that they would do like board education sessions. And we conducted a bunch of those board educational sessions. We suggested to them that in the rounds of recruiting new directors, that they would try to identify somebody who's like a tech-savvy executive to join the board and perhaps be accountable for overseeing, domains like, technology initiatives, cyber, tech risk, etc. We also did a bunch of peer connections, so connected, few of their board members with equivalent board members in other institutions or other organizations that were bigger and more mature than them. And then we had a level of like, today we call it agile, but it was really an iterative process that every quarter or every half a year, we would just come back and re-examine, those risk statements, risk tolerance statements, KRIs, KPIs, and just adjust them. And to be honest with you, I thought like we did a very thoughtful job. So we didn't do a whole lot of adjustment. Over time, we took them through the regular maturity curve, like doing, scenario planning, incident response, vulnerability assessments, like even like war rooms and how do you respond to stuff like this. And then as they continued to evolve, as the landscape continued to evolve, obviously, that became a little bit more, new things emerged that you would have to deal with it. And some of them are inherent issues, like when people talk about the broader kind of like, the attack surface with the geographical expansion, line expansion, technology expansion. These are things that would be inherent, and organizations need to be mindful that it's not a static state. They really need to be mindful of like their attack surface over time and how are they going to adjust their controls and reporting.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, available at Amazon.com and other booksellers. How long did you typically see that it took boards to where you started to see a change in their knowledge of cybersecurity?
I think it really varies, Todd, and my personal professional experience is that when organizations have been subjected to a traumatic event or like a significant breach that shook them, they tend to embrace the situation very quickly, and the level of uptake would be relatively quick. If they kind of like, if you get the sense that they are getting dragged into a discussion, and it is not necessarily, there is no sense of urgency associated with it, then most likely this is going to be like, a very long, maturity process.
Sure. And you mentioned that you'd take a domain like confidentiality and then break that down into other things for your risk statements. What would that look like?
Yeah, so like I'll give you a few examples. So like security and confidentiality, for example, was one of the areas that when we drilled them, and as I told you, I mean, it has been an iterative process. They insisted that their tolerance level would be none. So the risk statement that we came up with is we have no tolerance for unauthorized access to systems and confidential data, and will maintain strong controls to mitigate external threats against our technology infrastructure. Okay? Mm-hmm. We put between brackets something that recognizes that it's good to have that stance, but like there is no guarantee. So we said we also recognize that even with comprehensive risk mitigation strategies in place, it is not possible to prevent all occurrences of this risk. Okay. Then we went on to kind of like say, okay, and this is, I'm just giving you illustrative. This is not an exhaustive list. So we came up with something like, okay, security incidents, application vulnerabilities, overdue entitlements, infrastructure patch management. So these would be kind of like an example of domains, or data leakage, right? And then we would just like, then put statements associated with that. So like, let's call it number of severity 1, number of severity 2, frequency of these things happening. Or in the case of like patch management, well, the number or the percentage of high priority patches that have not been installed or not installed within a specific timeline. And over time, they would be tracking these things. Like if you follow the usual logic of like key risk indicators, KPIs, it would give the board a bit of a perspective, whether we are like, if you want to simplify it and kind of like say red, yellow, green, and what is our trending over time. So that was like, directionally the journey that we took them through.
How does a board decide when you've laid out these different risks, whether they should be taking the step to include outsourcing or purchase cyber insurance, for example?
Yeah, so these two topics were actually, if you remember at the beginning, I told you I walked into a room and it was just like scattered, thoughts. What about insurance? What about encryption? What about, DDoS attacks? But like there is no structured, framework or even frame of mind to kind of like go down that path. Like, okay, pick a topic, let's go through it, and let's prioritize what is it that we're trying to accomplish. So what we had to do is really structure the discussion to kind of like start with, let's just like talk about control objectives. Let's break them down into specific areas or domains. Let's talk about your risk tolerance. And I'm telling you, we had to really calibrate the risk tolerance. And I'll give you an example. You go talk with these folks and, take availability as like, a high level control objective. And then you kind of like, you get to say, well, what's your risk tolerance? And they would say, well, our risk tolerance is like very low. And then, you walk them through the process of like, you really need to think about like, critical apps versus non-critical apps. You get to think about is your web presence of that significance to your customers and stakeholders that it needs to be up all the time? In this case, for example, I mean, this is not a retail bank. It was a large pension fund. So you're not really going to be a subject to a DDoS attack, or by the time it happens, half of the big banks in the country or next to you, they would have been attacked to start with. So you would have a bit of an early warning. And then in the event that your website is not available for, let's say, half an hour, it is not a disaster like what a retail bank would be, feeling like. So it was a bit of an education to kind of like take them through this process and then land on the right risk tolerance. Where are you going to be spending the money? And is that the right or the best use of spending their money? As it happens, cyber insurance, for example, at the time, we invited like 3 firms to actually present the offering that they had from a cyber insurance perspective. And that board at the time, and by the way, I did not disagree with their conclusion. They actually concluded that it's not worth the money that they're going to be, spending on. And that led into a very productive and constructive discussion with many of the insurance providers that helped them kind of like mature their product, mature their offering, mature their assumptions and the kind of like conditions, if you will, as well as pricing. That now cyber insurance is really becoming like a valuable and relevant aspect or a tool in your toolkit as a professional or as a board member or as executive management.
Well, I think that sums it up really well in terms of looking at those risk statements that you start with the board and drilling that down, and then having more of a methodical way of looking at that, and then looking at those options that you have on the table, and that answer may be not to do something, not to go and purchase the cyber insurance, but direct those resources somewhere else.
Well, it was also a matter of prioritization. Like, you're not going to be able to do everything in the first year. So like, if you have to prioritize your resources, your capacity, your people, how would you rationalize that? So we really took them through the risk ranking that, let's just like use the risk ranking as like one of your guiding principles. There are a bunch of other things that, we got into, like, I don't want to make it sound complex, but like we looked at things in terms of like impact. We looked at things about ease of implementation. We looked at cost. So we went through like a structured process to engage executive management and the board to really land on, here are the 5-6 initiatives that we're going to undertake this year because they met all of these criteria that we agreed to upfront. By the way, Todd, I've learned like a very valuable experience as a professional that it's very valuable to actually agree on a set of principles before you embark upon an exercise like that. If you do not have a clear set of principles at the onset of this whole thing, everything gets rationalized and it becomes a personal discussion and an emotional discussion. Whereas if you actually have a principle-based approach and you've agreed to these set of principles at the get-go, at the beginning of this exercise, everybody owns the situation, and you kind of like have a governance framework to come up with rational outcomes and rational prioritization.
But what would some of those key principles be?
So, for example, I mean, we like many of the initiatives that we started with were actually the business objectives. So, like the business objectives, they in that particular situation, they came up with 5. So one of them was business growth. Another one was innovation and agility. Third one was cost management, customers and clients, risk and compliance. These were the 5. So we kind of like said, okay, let's come up with this. And it's very hard to satisfy this list because you could come up with something that is business and growth and innovation and agility, but that means you're going to spend a lot of money. So like it doesn't gel well with cost management, as an example, right? Innovation and agility vis-a-vis risk and compliance. I mean, you're venturing into new domains, and therefore, by definition, you're going to be taking on risks. But then what really helped us is getting into some of the things that we talked about earlier, like talking about the risk prioritization, the risk index, along with what we called the capability index. So that's kind of like your ability to execute money, resources, people, infrastructure, third-party providers. And that was part of it. It's like, as people over time kind of like embraced the notion that, it's one thing to have great ambition, it's another to have great execution.
Very, very good insight there. So this has been wonderful, and all CISOs and security leaders at some point are going to need to get that risk conversation with the board because it is so critical. Any other thoughts that you'd like to leave our CISOs with as they continue on this journey to be more successful with the board?
Yeah, I just I don't want to take a whole lot of your time, Todd. I will maybe leave with a few quick remarks. I think the first one that I see lots of CISOs and lots of people in the tech domain, and I myself may be guilty of it, is using lots of acronyms, especially with people who do not have a technology background. It is intimidating, and it's kind of like really half intelligible for them to kind of like be able to engage in any meaningful discussion. So just think of that. I think another thing, and I don't know if what I'm about to share with you is actually accurate, but I remember one time I was presenting to another board, and it was a bank, and the board member at the time, he was actually the founder and the CEO of a very, very successful private equity firm. And he basically looked to me and he said, well, okay, so you're the expert in this space. Why wouldn't we encrypt everything, for Christ's sake? We're a bank. And what I shared with him is a quote that came up to my mind at the time. And that's the part I don't know if it is accurate or not. And I think it was attributed to Winston Churchill. And it goes like this: for every complex problem, there seems to be a simple solution, and it's usually wrong. So as a CISO, when you get confronted with something like this, that sounds like, okay, well, let's go encrypt everything. That on the face of it, it may sound like, okay, yeah, that would work. We're a bank. Let's just go make it happen. You don't know what is the impact on your bandwidth. You don't know the impact on being able to run your operations at the same SLAs that your business partners are expecting of you. Mm-hmm. So you need to examine these things, meaning you have to put, the kind of you prioritize the objectives and the priorities of the business before you kind of you prioritize your own issues. It's important that you become the voice of reason, that you remind people if you feel that they are taking undue risk, but you really have to start with what's the business objective first.
That's a really great illustration of taking a technology concept and then going back to the business objectives. I really like that, and I think that's a great place to close. I don't think that could be any better. Thank you very much, Adel, for your involvement in the industry, your leadership through the years, your contribution to the CISO Compass book. Really appreciate all that you've done. So thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Todd. And, hopefully this would be of some use to your viewers and listeners. And I look forward to seeing it.
Thank you very much.
Cyber Reason is the champion for today's defenders. providing an endpoint security platform to prevent, detect, and respond to malicious operations on computers, mobile devices, servers, and the cloud. Cybereason. End cyber attacks from endpoints to the enterprise to everywhere. Learn more at cybereason.com/CISO stories.